So where did this all come from? I mean, sociology hasn't existed forever. It came about in the 19th century, did not exist before that. And what happened in the 19th century that it did? Well, actually, in truth, it didn't happen in the 19th century. It happened a lot earlier. There was two major changes in society which led up to the development of this area which we call sociology. The first, actually in your book I think they do it the other way around, but they said they have the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment. But in truth, the Enlightenment happened a lot earlier. And the Enlightenment was a philosophical change which has its roots back in the end of the 1400s, with the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, in which happened soon after the invention of the printing press, and that printing press was the end of the 15th century. Beginning of the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation was the beginning of the 16th century, and that was really because the two things sort of happened. People were getting fed up with the Catholic Church as the determiner of life. They know all and see all, and within the church themselves they would say it was this very corrupt, and people were buying heaven for buying their place in heaven to buy for the priests, and they decided they didn't like that. And once the printing press was the movable type printing press was invented, then there was a possibility of spreading knowledge on a much broader basis, and that actually started people to thinking differently because they're able to read and they're able to get knowledge across the board. And so what happened was people started to question the mystic and irrational basis of medieval society, and they grew within the next 150 years a philosophy which is based more on rational thought. The first a religion on Protestantism was more on rational thought, and it changed the whole nature of the relationship of individuals to the society. We don't really have that much written in the Enlightenment here, but once as that grew, as people began to become more individualized and be able to think for themselves, because once you be able to read and once you be able to you took responsibility for yourselves there, and also with that there grew the philosophy of people being more responsible for themselves. This grew into the philosophy of rationalism, and that eventually brought about the possibility and the idea of what we have in the American Revolution and in the French Revolution. Where in the American Revolution, of course, we have the idea that a person is responsible for his own life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and it was a person's own efforts which were going to give him that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not his connection to a religious body or his subservience to the king who will protect him and will give him his life and his, although not necessarily his liberty, but his life he certainly was able to get, and safety, and if he needed education he can go to the church. People didn't really expect very much education, at least the masses did not really expect much education, because they had their life and they had their food basically, and they were looking for the salvation which the church was able to give them. But that grew to a great extent during the 1600s, and at the same time there was more commerce being Western European commerce was becoming spread throughout the world with the colonization of the Americas. by the Spanish, first by the Spanish, and then by the Dutch, and then the English, and of course the French. The French were in Canada, and the Dutch were the first ones in Northern America, but the English soon took over, and the Spanish in Central and South America, and the Portuguese in Brazil. And also at that time they started the colonization of South Africa, as they were trying to travel across the around the southern tip of Africa in order to get the trade from India and China and the Far East. So these factors, with that trade, grew a mercantile class, a class of middle class people who became wealthy, not because they were of aristocracy, because they were of noble birth, which was in the Middle Ages. People were wealthy because they were nobles, because they owned land, and if they didn't own land, they were serfs. And there was a very small middle class, and in Europe, a lot of the middle class in the Middle Ages was actually either very small or by the Jewish population, because they were outside of that social structure. But they became the idea that people were more responsible for themselves. And that led to the American Revolution, and it led to the French Revolution. But there was a big difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And the American Revolution was actually very successful. And the French Revolution was not at all successful. It became completely out of bounds. It was not. There was a blood in the streets of Paris, and society was not functioning at all. So at that time, people started to try to question, why? What's going on here? How can we keep society together? And that became the kernel and the beginnings of sociology. But it was the enlightenment, the thinking of the individuals being able to and rational